was in northeastern Pennsylvania, somewhere in the Delaware Water Gap recreational area east of Scranton, in the woods on 10 acres. And his wife is an editor for the New York Times, and they have 4 children and a bear. Is that correct? They have a bear.
And a bear named Fartles.
So the topic tonight, and I'll let Seamus do the talking here, but it's on his new book, From the Taller Tower, The Rise of the American Shooter. And I'll turn it over to Seamus.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you, folks, for having me again. The last time I was down and in person, I had an absolutely delightful time. I love Arden, and I love what this organization that you've got here is doing. I love this kind of thing. Talk a little bit about the new book. I woke up this morning to a tweet. This was after 9 or 10 events in the last 2 weeks with this book, mostly with largely sympathetic audiences to my analysis of sort of how the peculiarly American epidemic of mass public shootings developed, how it emerged, what it says about us, what it says about our sins of commission and our sins of omission. The audiences have generally been appreciative. But I woke up this morning to find that the American Conservative had written a review of the book. And my first reaction was, oh, Christ. But I read it, and it was a favorable review. The author's takeaways from the book were not what I would have expected. They're not what others who've read the book have taken away. But it made me tremendously hopeful. It made me tremendously hopeful because it showed me that there is, even in this most contentious, most divided debates, still room for common ground, as long as we don't surrender our voices to the extremists who claim to speak for us. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. The book began, and I'll tell you how the book began. It began right after the massacre at the Mandalay Bay Hotel in Las Vegas. I had just finished a book for the University of Texas Press. They've been my publisher for my last 3 books about water in Texas. Nothing whatsoever to do with this subject. I looked at what happened in Las Vegas. No, not what happened. There is no passive construction in this book, and I will not use passive construction tonight. The atrocity that was committed at Las Vegas echoed for me the very first of this peculiar brand of atrocity, this peculiarly American brand of atrocity, which began on August 1st, 1966, when a narcissistic, sociopathic, aggrieved man climbed to a tower at the University of Texas and for 90 minutes murdered people, 17 of them in all. In the half century between that atrocity and the atrocity in Las Vegas, we've created myths, we've made believe, we've enforced a deathly silence. There's a line that appears throughout the book: there is no silence on earth deeper than the silence between gunshots. It's deafening. It drowns out everything else. And in those 50 some odd years between the atrocity in Austin and the atrocity in Las Vegas, we filled all that silence with myths and misconceptions. We've avoided our own culpability. In Las Vegas, an aggrieved, narcissistic, sociopathic murderer stripped away every one of those myths and brought this to its simplest form. More and more deadly firearms, a taller tower, and a higher death toll. The book seeks to examine, and I also look at incidents that have happened subsequent to that. The book, I sit down with first responders. I sit down with experts. I sit down with survivors. I sit down with the loved ones. For the most part, except for one instance in the book, which didn't even happen in the United States. It happened in New Zealand, but it was a distinctly American-style massacre, clearly inspired by us and ours, in his own words. I seek to dismantle those myths and place the responsibility not just for why these have happened, but for what in ourselves we need to address to begin to correct it. And in that process, I don't name any of the killers but two. The first, who I refer to as the first modern American mass shooter, and the Las Vegas murderer, who I refer to as the first post-modern American mass shooter, and the model of those who will come after. One of the things that I also try to do in the book is to explore the cost of these, not just in terms of the lives lost. We've become inured to those numbers, but in terms of the impact they have on our culture. I'm going to read a little bit to you, and then we can begin to just have a conversation. This is from chapter 9. There's a wonderful phrase, the fog of war. What the fog of war means is war is so complex, it's beyond the ability of the human mind to comprehend all the variables. Our judgment, our understanding are not adequate. Former U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. You'd think by now we'd have a word for it, word to describe the horror, the trauma, the confusion, and the misconceptions that spiderweb out from the scene of a mass public shooting in a digital instant, touching not just those who are at ground zero, but all of us, turning millions of us into survivors or witnesses to an atrocity in real time. Trauma is one word for it, yes. So is terror and chaos. In combat, they call it the fog of war, but we have no word for the fog of war in peacetime. You can see how profoundly the trauma of the fog of war in peacetime affects even those who are trained to face it. It's etched into the blank stare of the veteran police officer we met in Chapter 3, who, when faced with the brutal massacre of children in his hometown, simply erased the memory. I took the perimeter, he insisted. You can hear it in the creak of the stairs late at night as the first cop through the door at the massacre at West Nichols Mines pads to his sleeping daughter's bedroom. You can feel it in the awful weight of the voice of the young police officer summoned to Santa Fe High School near Galveston, Texas, in the moments after a shooting, ordered to hold the line, to be part of a force deployed in accordance with best police practices to stop the killing so that he and his comrades could stop the dying. All the while, his own mother, a substitute teacher at that school, lay dead or near dead inside. I'm supposed to protect and serve people, he later told his family attorney. I couldn't even protect my own mother. Indeed, in this fog of war and peacetime, we are demanding that our first responders, our police officers, our EMTs, our firefighters face horrors on their home turf as great as any they'd find on the bloodiest foreign battlefield. That's something we haven't asked American soldiers to do since at least the Civil War, and yet we demand that our first responders do it. We look away when they stumble out of the gun smoke and blood and double over, retching into the bushes, as police officers reportedly did when a combat veteran armed with a .45 caliber Glock 21, a cache of extended magazines he had smuggled across the state border from Nevada, and a knife killed 12 people before killing himself at the Borderline nightclub in Thousand Oaks, California on November 7th, 2018. Among the dead was Telorfanos, an ex-sailor who'd already been traumatized just over a year earlier when he'd helped pull the wounded and the dead off the killing field below the towering Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino in Las Vegas during what remains the highest casualty mass public shooting in our history. The Borderline, that young man's mother and father, Mark and Susan Orfanos, told me, was supposed to be his haven, his safe space. It's a grim measure of our times that a young military veteran had heroically faced combat twice in his life, and both times it was at home. It's a measure of that young man himself that even though he had somehow escaped the initial onslaught and had gotten out of the nightclub, he raced back inside to save others and confront the murderer. When responders found Telorfanos' body, they discovered that not only had he been shot, but he had been stabbed once in the neck, an indication, the coroner told his grieving mother, that Tel had gone down fighting. It's deathly cold solace, but it gives his mother some shred of comfort to think that he didn't die afraid. I tell myself that Tel was so angry that this person was doing what he was doing that he just flew at him, Susan Orfanos tells me through her tears, lapsing for just an instant into the present tense, a sign that the trauma is not and perhaps never will be in the past. I don't want my son to be afraid, she says, or to hurt. And I try to tell myself that Tel would have been so angry, he would have confronted that man and it would have been over in seconds. In the aftermath of these atrocities, we focus, understandably perhaps, on the killers and their possible motives, or more compassionately, we recite the names of the wounded and the dead, and so we should. But often our incantations drown out other voices we should listen to. We should hear them out of compassion, yes, but out of self-interest as well. There's much that we must give back to those first responders, like the ones who staggered, drenched in blood and choking on gun smoke out of the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, after a steroid-abusing gunman with a history of alleged domestic violence, a valid state firearms license, and an image of himself as an Islamic avenger, opened fire and killed 49 people at a gay-friendly nightclub, a place the killer was known to frequent himself. Deborah Bidell, a professor who runs a clinic at the University of Central Florida that treats first responders, spoke to ProPublica in an article detailing symptoms of PTSD among those who dashed into the Pulse nightclub on our behalf. As she puts it, there are just some events that are so horrible that no human being should be able to just process that and put it away. The hidden psychic wounds of post-traumatic stress on our police officers and first responders put a terrible burden on them. And responding to this is a challenge to us all. Take a few steps back from ground zero in any of these attacks, and the fog of war and peacetime is just as poisonous and impenetrable. You needn't go far. Just travel a few yards down the hallway from the classrooms at Sandy Hook, where children were murdered, to another classroom where frightened children were murdered, where frightened children huddled, fearing that they would be next. What can you say to a father whose 9-year-old son is tortured by nightmares, who's facing years, perhaps decades of therapy to come to grips with the traumatic memory of hearing gunshots and the awful silence between them? A child who is stalked in his sleep by the image of a man all dressed in black, his face obscured, pulling at his classroom door. You can tell him that it wasn't the murderer trying to get him, but rather a cop making sure the door was locked, making sure that the child and his classmates were indeed safe before moving on to make sure other children were too. And that would be absolutely true. It was indeed a cop who was there only to protect him. But would that knowledge exercise the picture of a maniacal, faceless killer, all dressed in black, that possesses this child's dreams? When your nightmares are forged out of gunmetal, they don't bend easily to fit the facts. And the fog spreads. There aren't enough police barricades or enough rolls of bright yellow police tape in the world to confine it to the perimeter of a crime scene. Not in a world as deeply interconnected as ours. Not in a world where news, imperfect and incomplete, can circle the globe in the time it takes a dying heart to stop beating. And it isn't just the mass media that sparks the fog. Consider this. When the cops finally made it into the charnel house that had been the Pulse nightclub, it wasn't just the blood and the stench of murder that knocked them back on their heels. It was the surreal sound of so many cell phones left behind by those who fled the massacre, or still in the hands or pockets of those who didn't, chirping, buzzing, ringing, even playing a macabre merengue. And who was calling? Everyone they knew. When they found Tel Orfanos' body on the floor of the borderline nightclub, he still had his phone. There were over 1,000 texts on it, his father tells me. There were a couple of hundred voicemails, people calling him from all over the country who knew him, asking him if he was okay. That's hundreds of people, perhaps more than 1,000, from every corner of the nation, touched in real time by the trauma of one death in one mass shooting. Multiply that by all of the dead and all of the wounded and all of those who've been spared in all the churches and nightclubs and synagogues and schools, all the malls and Walmarts and movie theaters, and you see how the trauma of these rare atrocities spreads like a virus across the globe. Indeed, the atrocity at the borderline just down the road from the Orphanos' home had already touched people across the country before Mark and Susan Orphanos had even learned that it had happened. They sent their son their usual good night text and had gone to bed, only to be awakened to their nightmare at 2 a.m. by a phone call from a close family friend to a close family friend on the other side of the country. Tells godmother, who had just learned of the massacre from the news. They immediately flipped on the television and desperately called their son. His voicemail box was full, Susan tells me. In our hyper-connected digital world, linked by social media and the phones in our hands, the immediacy of trauma is felt by thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps millions in an instant, even before the first breathless reporter arrives on the scene, even before the cops do. Sometimes Twitter explodes, grainy cell phone videos punctuated by the sound of gunfire or of a terrified survivor weeping or screaming ricochet around the world. It's horror with a hashtag. There is no context, no big picture. You can never make sense of the senseless. And when you're running for your life, you don't even try. There are just jagged shards of terror. Indeed, as we saw at Christchurch and at Pulse, sometimes the killers even broadcast themselves on social media to amplify their horror and bask in it. And the fog of war and peacetime and the trauma that works in its midst spreads. One does not have to be a combat soldier in war or visit a refugee camp in Syria or the Congo to experience trauma. Psychiatrist and researcher Bessel van der Kolk writes in the prologue to his landmark book, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. He's writing specifically about those in closest concentric rings to trauma survivors, their families, their friends, and their acquaintances, but he notes that the effects of trauma radiate out from there, touching those who know them until at last it can infect, quote, our histories and our cultures. It's a drifting fog and it's boundless. I caught a glimpse of the spreading fog myself not so very long ago when, in the wake of another deadly active shooter situation, an old friend, a woman I had not spoken to in years, reached out to me on Facebook from across the country just hours after she had watched her best friend die from a killer's bullet. I called her immediately and we talked for about an hour. I'm not going to tell you what was said. I'm not even going to tell you which of the many active shooter situations she had survived. None of that is any of your business. She didn't reach out to me because I'm a reporter or because she knew I was working on this book, and I didn't call her for information, for another story, for a book already far too full of them. She reached out to an old friend because she had experienced an unimaginable trauma and was in pain, and I called her back to share that pain and to offer what solace I could. And the fog of war in peacetime and the trauma spread further. We tend, when we think of these atrocities, to think of them as defined by space or by time. And we imagine that there's something unique to the place where they occur and something peculiar to the criminal who commits them. None of that is true. We live, many of us, in analog isolation, hardly knowing the people across the street and not knowing the people down the street at all. And yet we are hyper-connected and know the most intimate details of the lives of virtual strangers. 3,000 miles away. We seek out like-minded people, and we form virtual communities. But we are a culture awash in firearms. We have more guns than people, and we have them in the hands of fewer and fewer people every year. But we are also a people who have turned a sense of victimhood into status, grievance into an identity, an entire cottage industry in this country has emerged, fueling the sense of grievance and victimhood. We gather in these clusters, as frankly, we're doing right now. We'll reinforce the best in us or the worst. It's out of that. It was at the dawn of this cultural shift that's led us here that the first of our modern mass murderers climbed the steps to the observation deck at the tower of the University of Texas. The first mass public shooting, and the first to be broadcast in real time as it was occurring. And in the 50 years since, we've become more isolated, more narcissistic, more obsessed with our own grievances, more willing to identify ourselves as victims. And we've made millions more guns. And in the book, I explore, to the best of my ability, how we have, as a culture, rather than confront that, we found a dozen or so unique ways to silence discussion about it. We found ways to remain in that silence between gunshots. That's sort of a broad overview of the book. Now, I know this is a subject that I'm sure some of you have questions about and others of you have strong opinions on. So let's talk about them, shall we? Does anybody have anything to say?
I'm curious as to your opening comments about the review and the unexpected review.
Yep.
And you touched on the notion of hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
You expand on where that hope.
I will tell you where the hope for me comes. One of the things that I talk about in the book fairly extensively is the idea of weapons, and very specific weapons. Let me begin this with, for those of you who don't know, I am I am a 62-year-old white guy with terrible teeth and 4 guns. I have a 30-30 that I don't use. I have a 25 caliber handgun that's hidden in the attic. I have a 22 caliber rifle. I have a 45 caliber flintlock pistol, and I have a 50 caliber flintlock rifle. I only use the flintlock pistol and the flintlock rifle. I only carry the weapons that the Second Amendment explicitly gives me the right to carry. And I carry them for hunting. I'm an avid hunter. I'm a gun owner. There is hardly a day that goes by from the middle of October until the end of January. And to some degree, the firearms that I carry, the flintlock rifle and the flintlock pistol, are totems. They're cultural artifacts and representations of the man I would like to be. That's a man who can hunt deftly and mercifully, skilled enough to do what needs be done with one shot and one shot alone. I'm not that man. I fall far short of being that man. The weapons that are drawn, that are most often used in these offenses, in these atrocities, are also fetish items. They are designed and marketed to be totems. They are what I think is a fairly twisted version of manhood that can be bought off the rack. And they are marketed directly to the cultural fracture that I've just been talking about, that sense of grievance, that sense of victimhood, that sense of fear, that sense of paranoia. They are marketed that way. Now, there is a phrase that I use throughout the book. It's a phrase that I picked up from the cops in responding to these kinds of situations, which is stop the killing, stop the dying. Those are two separate actions. Those are two separate actions. In order to address these ongoing atrocities, which bear a great deal of resemblance to many of the other 40,000 gun deaths we experience in this country, we need to view it through the paradigm of stop the killing and stop the dying. In my mind, stopping the killing means enacting common sense gun regulations that slow the acquisition and, to the degree possible, prevent these weapons from getting into the hands of killers. And that, in my mind, requires common sense gun regulations. That's the stop the killing part. The stop the dying part means addressing those cultural pathologies that I've been talking about. That's not something that's going to happen overnight. That's not something that's going to happen in a day, in a year, in an election cycle. It's something that's going to happen over the span of a generation and perhaps more generations. The critic, a historian from the American Conservative, stressed the second part of that formulation. in why she approved of the book. I'll take it. I'll take it. Because it's the beginning of a place from which we can, after having so long abdicated, sat in silence, and allowed our positions, to be abused and mischaracterized. The fact that she can identify some place where she and I can stand and meet, and where one of the things about being a 62-year-old white guy with bad teeth is that I am pretty much who believes very strongly in common sense gun control. Is that I am absolutely dead center in the demographic of American gun owners. I'm unusual in that I wrote this book. But that's the only thing that makes me unusual as a gun owner. What I own, what I do with them, how I feel about them, and how I feel that we need additional regulations, and we need the regulations to be more stringently enforced, places me smack dead in the center. Polls will tell you of the majority of American gun owners, but we have not been heard. My encounters with people on the other end of the spectrum have been either silence, don't politicize it, or using the position that the gun lobby has been pushing, arm yourself because you're in danger. This was a point of view coming from, I think, smack dab in the center of the conservative universe, saying we do have to recognize our responsibility for the cultural pathogen. And that gives us a place to start. Does that answer your question, Pat?
Yes. Yeah, I think that notion of the cultural aspect of it, it is a very, I mean, there's a great deal of inertia around the myths that you probably are alluding to. The myth, I'm sure there's many, how do you stop a bad guy with a gun? Well, you have a good guy with a gun.
There's a moment in the book, Pat. I absolutely, and this is another place where she agrees, because I blow the good guy with the gun myth apart. Mm-hmm. There's a story in the book. There was a massacre at a church on a Sunday morning south of San Antonio, a place called Sutherland Springs. A guy who should never have had access to a firearm, who should have been caught by red flag laws, who never should have had a weapon in his hand, executed 27 people with a semi-automatic rifle. There was a guy down the street, a guy by the name of Stephen Williford, an absolute hero, an absolute hero. He was asleep on the couch in his front room when his daughter came in and said she heard shots at the church. She ran up against his wishes, saw what was going on, came back. Stephen got up barefoot, went to his gun safe, took out his own AR-15. He has several of them. He's a competition shooter. Ran barefoot up the street of Sutherland Spring, ran outside the church, could hear the gunshots going on in the church, called into the church. Doesn't know why. He thinks, he honestly believes, and I believe he honestly believes this, that the, quote, Holy Spirit was speaking through him. He called into the church. The murderer put down his own AR-15, came out with a handgun. They traded shots. Stephen hit him on the side, but the guy was wearing a ballistic vest. He was not wounded at all. He was bruised. Got into his car, fled. Stephen flagged down a passing motorist. They chased him. They chased him for 11 miles before the murderer called his father and then blew his own brains out. Stephen tells me that he would have killed the guy, but he's grateful that he didn't, that he didn't have to. But let's go back to the beginning of that story. Stephen runs barefoot to a church with stained glass windows on a Sunday morning. Inside that church, it's dark. There's gunsmoke. There's chaos. There's confusion. Stephen calls inside. Guy puts down his gun, pulls out his handgun, and walks out. He didn't come out because he knew there was a good guy with a gun out there. He couldn't see that. He stopped murdering people because of a good guy. And if you turn around and you dissect the comparatively rare cases, it is actually far more likely that an unarmed civilian will interrupt one of these killers than an armed civilian. 3.9% of the time versus 11.9% of the time. Most of the time, they interrupt themselves. But even there, it's not the good guy with the gun. It's the good guy. I speak toward the end of the book with a guy who's now in his 40s. He's in a prison in Massachusetts. The day he turned 18, he was a student at a place called Simon's Rock College in Western Massachusetts. An immigrant from Taiwan. He had wrapped himself completely in all of the American myths. Red Dawn was his favorite movie. The day he turned 18, because of a fluke in the law, his family had been living in Montana, he walked into a gun/hardware store and bought an SKS, a knockoff of an AK-47. Came back, and that evening he launched into a mass shooting at his school in which 3 people were killed. He was taken alive. He has claimed that he understands and appreciates the atrocity that he committed, and that he wants to be available, a resource for people who want to stop it. I have no goddamn idea whether he's telling the truth. I have no idea. And neither will you when you read it. And I tell you that right up front. But I will tell you this. The most chilling words in the book come from him. I asked him if he thought a good guy with a gun would have stopped him. And he later called me, made sure that I understood the context, made sure that I understood that he wasn't shifting responsibility, made sure that I understood that he was talking about the culture at large, made sure that I understood all of that. But I asked him, would a good guy with a gun have stopped him? And he said, I thought I was the good guy with the gun.
I'm going to let some others here have any questions or comments.
Anybody, anything?
I have a question or a comment.
Sure.
So in the recent brouhaha about the NRA and how they've been, the Texas has just threw out the case, and some reporters are saying this could be the end of the NRA because New York is going to be able to really, screw them to the wall with bankrupt, with all the stuff, all the money that's been
Right, and I think you're probably going to see criminal charges come out of that as well. Yes.
Right. So if the NRA were to be dissolved, and it does seem that they don't speak to all gun really.
They never spoke for gun owners. The only thing the NRA is.
How might that change? How could that change the culture of gun?
Not at all, and I'll explain to you why. In my opinion, it's been a very long time. It's really been since the 1970s that and there was an uprising in the NRA. It was basically hijacked by far right and corporate extremists. Became a mouthpiece really for a handful of gun manufacturers. They have been on the ropes now for probably 5 or 6 years. Okay, and when I say we, I mean we in the media, the American left, and much of the American center have been propping them up. We've been pretending that they have an influence that goes far beyond the influence that they actually have. And now that's about to come to an end. And so they really have become entirely irrelevant. You can measure that simply by their silence in the last month, after a series of fairly high profile and frankly predictable mass shootings. Here's the problem, though. They had a hell of a run for a good 30 years. And in that 30 years, they managed to successfully define the debate, define the nature of the debate. And so they're no longer relevant, but they're also no longer necessary, because that paranoia, that delusion, that fear that they injected into the culture at large, it's in our bloodstream now. It's in our bloodstream now. There are other organizations that are coming up that are even less circumspect in their nonsense than the NRA. But really, at this point, the poison that they had, that's metastasized. And that's what we need to address. So the NRA is they're a straw man now. They mean virtually nothing, and they probably will become either non-existent or an absolute spent shell of their former selves. But I don't see that as having a significant impact on the debate going forward. What I do see having a significant impact going forward is a consequence of that, however. As Pat mentioned, I have 4 kids. They don't all live at home anymore. They range in age from 16 to 31. They grew up in a house where, as I pointed out to you, not only have there always been guns, but they would not recognize me between October and January if I didn't have one in my hand. And yet, not one of them will pick up a firearm. Not one of them will pick up a firearm. They have no interest in it. Why? Because it's a totem of another tribe. It's a totem of another tribe. It has to do with something that is utterly, utterly foreign to them. It belongs to a culture to which they do not belong. This is the thing. They don't have the same kind of love and affection for the Second Amendment that my generation does. Not necessarily me. I interpret it somewhat differently than a lot of my compatriots, but to them, it means nothing. And so I honestly do believe that's because I think largely of the intransigence of the gun lobby. I think the reality is, I've said this in a number of talks. I think the biggest threat right now to the idea of the Second Amendment, as some of the more extreme among them interpret it, isn't going to come from the Joe Bidens of the world. It's going to come from the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world. It's going to come from the Briscoe Caines out in Texas of the world. It's going to come from their intransigence and their unwillingness to take even moderate steps. So the NRA is toast. The NRA is irrelevant. The poison is out there. And I think to a very great extent, the extremists have commended the ingredients of their poison chalice to their own lips. That answer your question?
That's good. That's good. My son, who's raised by a very liberal parents, but is now a federal prosecutor in Miami and has many guns.
Mm-hmm.
And but he also does believe that there should be no reason to license them, and there's no reason to not to do basic laws.
He supports the idea of background checks. He supports the idea of registration of certain kinds of weapons and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think, well, that's, and he's about as he's pretty damn conservative by my standards.
This is the thing. This is what I'm talking about. There is room among the vast majority of us for common ground. I know very few cops, and certainly nobody above a certain level, that doesn't support at least moderate steps towards gun control, that opposes this idea of unpermitted concealed carry, that objects to open carry. And these, I know very few of even the most conservative people. The problem is they've largely been quiet too, while somebody else has been doing the talking for them.
And he says that open carry is actually a lot more dangerous because it's threatening. I mean, he thinks states that have open carry have the potential for a lot more violence just because
it's not. That's not just an impression. There are studies that indicate. Mm-hmm. There are studies that indicate that. There are studies. The NRA used to turn around and throw out in this line about 20,000 incidents a year in America, where somebody turned around and fended off a crime, because they had a handgun or they had access to a firearm. Somebody went in and actually looked at those cases one at a time. It was more like 20 than a couple of hundred where that actually happened. For the most part, what you had situations where you had two drunks sitting on a park bench. Both of them had handguns, got into a fight. They both pulled out their handguns and they both ran away, and they both claimed that they had turned around and defended themselves against crime with their handguns. This is the kind of nonsense that skews our perspective. And because we've been so lax at the gun lobby's insistence, in actually doing the kind of research and studies that would make this sort of thing common knowledge, right, it's generally missing from the debate.
So what are your thoughts on getting the guns that are out there out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them?
Here's what I think. I think universal background checks would go a long way to doing that. Okay, the reality is that the vast majority, it won't do it completely. It won't do it completely. But let's face it, all right. When there's a shooting in Baltimore with an illegal handgun, or in Philadelphia, that handgun was purchased legally someplace. It was in the hands of a legal gun owner. And somehow or another, it found its way onto the street. If you required a background check on every firearm transfer and held the last guy who had that gun accountable, I think you'd find that to be a lot fewer guns in the hands of our rural and urban criminals. You'd find a lot fewer handguns in the hands of spouse abusers. I think if you enforced some of the laws we have and expanded them into states that refuse to have them, things like red flag laws, I think you'd go a long way towards that. I do believe, I didn't originally, but I do the anti-gun lobby used to, or the anti-gun control lobby used to turn around and deride the old assault weapons ban, which, by the way, was never meant to address this. The assault weapons ban grew out of a flawed piece of legislation, which was designed and intended to negatively target people of color. It was part of the crime bill that did that, and nobody was looking at mass shooters when they turned around and said we're going to ban Tech 9s and certain kinds of AR-15s and the like. They thought they were going after gangbangers. They thought they were going after Tony Montana. Okay, but the reality is the number of mass public shootings declined during that period of time and began to increase both in frequency and in lethality after 2007, when that ban expired. Now, the critics turned around and said, well, it was all cosmetic. It was all cosmetic. It was just, you were banning guns because of the way they looked. It was true. You could buy a firearm that did effectively the same thing that a banned weapon would do, but it didn't have that martial militaristic appearance. The thing is, most of these clowns, these losers, these failures, these frauds who commit these kinds of atrocities, that's what they're drawn to. They're drawn to the appearance. And they'll turn around and they'll tell you, well, you know what? If you outlaw guns, only outlaws will have guns. That's bullshit. That's simply bullshit. I forgive my language, but if you turn around and you look at these guys, first of all, if I hold you accountable or you hold me accountable for the next transfer of that gun in my hand, the buck stops with me. You want to talk about rights? Let's talk about responsibilities. Responsibility, the buck stops with me. Mm-hmm. But more to the point, if I turn around and I do that and I ban that weapon, and I know there'll still be some of them out there, well, the guy will just go buy it on the street. Conjure for yourself for a moment. You've seen him. The image of the brutal murderer at Sandy Hook. Got a picture of him in your mind? Imagine that little son of a bitch trying to buy a gun on the streets of New Haven. They don't have the skills, they don't have the savvy, they don't have the character or ability to do these things. You would stop it. Not entirely, but at least partially.
I have a question. In the whole spectrum of the debates over gun control, I've always wondered, what are the members of the NRA doing who are seeing what's happening to our society? What are they doing politically? Is the only person that speaks is LaPierre, who's obviously crazy?
That's largely the case, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book.
But why do people belong to an organization that they don't agree with what they're doing? I just have been puzzled about. I'm pretty sure most of the people who are part of the NRA are good people. I don't understand how they can watch what I watch and everybody else watches and say, this is the organization we want to be representing us.
For most of them, they don't see it as representative. For most of them, they see it as being, they're a member of that the same way they're a member. They're more committed to members of Sam's Club than they are to the NRA. Okay. This is it's just a touchstone. And they're not really involved, and they get the magazine, and that's fine. But for some others among them, okay, there are within them, within the NRA's dwindling membership, some who honestly have been, I think, hoodwinked into fear and paranoia, who honestly do, it's very easy to imagine, and I go into this in great detail, including some personal stories. It's very easy to think you're a hero until you're tested. Okay.
Until you what?
Until you're tested, until you're actually in a situation where you have to face something like this. And everybody likes to imagine that they're a hero. So a little bit of this is play dress up. Okay. For some of them. And some of them it's just basically sort of a virtual social club. But the NRA membership rarely rises up in mass to do anything. Okay. Frankly, I'm kind of the youngest among them. They really rise up at all anymore.
Well, the NRA began really as a gun safety.
Absolutely. And then there was an uprising there was actually hijacked in the 1970s, and that's when Yacht Commodore LaPierre was brought in and all of that. But prior to that, you're right. It was a responsible gun organization that represented the interests of gun owners, promoted the idea of gun safety, and they were still doing vestigial aspects of that, but not really. But that's what it was, and they were very vocal, for example, in support of the original Firearms Act, which banned Thompson guns and the like. They had opposed more stringent, to be fair, they had opposed even more stringent controls, but they supported that. They had, up until the 1970s, supported reasonable common sense gun control, but subsequent to that, they did not.
So nobody has come forward to challenge LaPierre and that.
Oh yeah, there was an attempted coup 2 years ago, and that's what exposed all of these fractures and fissures, and out of that, you began to see the corruption, the profligacy with money, and that's how all of this got exposed. It got exposed because there basically was an attempt to turn around and try and topple the LaPierre wing, and it failed. Okay, it wasn't led by a guy I would want to join anything that was led by. It was led by Ollie North, but it's. But yeah, that's how this began to kind of accelerate. How their demise began to kind of accelerate, because then suddenly all of this became public.
So is that one of the positive things that might occur as we attempt to make common sense laws? Is at least that lobby group isn't going to be as powerful?
Well, as I said, that lobby group is finished. They're toast. But I think that to a very great extent, the damage that they've done is going to be
deep.
The narrative that they've injected into our bloodstream, the poison that they've injected into the national bloodstream is going to be with us for a very long time. It's no longer necessary to have them. It's like, in essence, the guy who gave you the Black Plague is dying. Okay, but it doesn't do anything to help your Black Plague.
Mhm.
So I find it very interesting, this conservative review that you had of the book, because and that you appreciate what she was saying on the level that you know, she addresses the issue of the pathologies, and that is one of the more important threads to address in dealing with the cultural phenomenon that we're dealing with here. And I'm just wondering how, I mean, and that's a fairly common thing for, it seems like the conservatives tend to, you know, point at its psychology, it's, you know, we've got to do the red flag laws, we, you know, and the liberals point to the gun regulations, and, you know, that you got to get the guns off the streets and out of the hands of people. And we, you know, I think what you're saying, it's a both and situation, but we can't seem to agree on that kind of legislation. There's no agreement or compromise.
I had I had the opportunity to do a panel. It was Bob Duff, who's the president of the Connecticut State Senate, Senator Chris Murphy, who's the senator out of Connecticut, and myself, having a discussion about this about 2 weeks ago at R.J. Julius. And the three of us actually were fairly optimistic that we have right now, in part because right now the principal lobbying body is distracted. You have a plurality in the Senate with some degree of bipartisanship. I think Toomey is kind of leaning in the right direction. I think Manchin is again doable. He was after Sandy Hook. I think he may be again. I think Toomey may be again. I think you have an opportunity. But one of the things that has to happen in order for that to happen is that those of us on the more or less left, okay, who are gun owners like me, who have been quiet, and this is one of the reasons I wrote this book, was to turn around and kind of encourage my fellows to stand up and talk, okay? We need to make our voices heard, and our counterparts on the center right need to do the same thing. And this gave me hope that that was about to happen, or that may be beginning to happen. And then we can get the critical mass, I think, that's necessary to take the first few halting steps. Like I say, my objectives here right now for this moment are fairly limited. They're fairly modest. What I'm looking for is I'm looking for things like universal background checks. I'm looking at expanding red flag laws. I'm looking at raising enough of a voice. You know, you just had a mass shooting in Indiana. Okay. Indiana had one by a guy who literally had been determined to be a threat and still was able to go out and buy a gun. Indiana had one of the first red flag laws. They passed their red flag law decades ago. One of the other problems is that this has become so hyper-partisan among the extremes that you have brought into power judges and prosecutors, and you have among the rank and file, not rarely among the brass, but among the rank and file of some police departments, people who fundamentally do not believe in these laws and tend to not enforce them. So we need to enforce the enforcement of the laws that we have, and we need to expand the ones that are inadequate. And that's a beginning. I don't know that we're going to get an assault weapons ban passed. I don't know that that's going to happen this time. Eventually, it's going to happen. I don't know that it's going to happen this time. But even those two steps will go a significant part of the way to reducing the body count. And there's an old line in the Talmud, you know, you save one life, it's as if you saved the whole world. Well, we could save scores, hundreds, maybe thousands, with just these steps. Yeah.
I have a question and a comment. I'm not from this country originally, so I didn't grow up with guns. I'm from the Netherlands. To me, I look at it as a frontier mentality. I look at gun ownership as in the DNA of this country.
Yep.
And I think I separate gun ownership, legitimate gun ownership, from those people who go out for mass shootings, which are probably psychologically disturbed or some other
The way I put it, sir, is that they're just like us, only more so. They are just like us, only more so. They embody the same. They embody all of the things that have become our current set of values, just in a slightly more extreme way. But yes, the gun ownership is part of the American DNA. No question about it. No question about it. And it's one of the things that's made it such an intractable problem. But it's not impossible. Because there's another thing that's also part of the DNA of America, and that's gotten overshadowed. And that is the idea that rights carry with them responsibilities. We have not heard much about responsibility for the last 30 years, and certainly never from the gun lobby. But you hear it every day. I hear it every day from my fellow gun owners. So what we need to do is we need to start putting that back into the bloodstream.
But following up on that, it looks then that to make these changes hold, it's going to take a long time, and because it's a cultural shift, and in other things like racial issues, this country has moved quite slowly.
Yeah, it has, and they are all in a lot of ways interlinked. In a lot of ways, they're interconnected. It is very difficult to separate the history of gun ownership, which you say is baked into the DNA, and I agree completely, from racial issues. Okay, the Second Amendment, to a very great extent, was not designed to turn around and send round balls flying at British officers. It was designed to control runaway slaves. It was designed to control restive populations, and I think that's very much part of it. And I think that remains very much a part of it. And I could not agree with you more that turning around and unwinding that Gordian knot in American culture is going to take generations. That's the stop the dying part. The first thing we need to do is the stop the killing part. And we can do that with a couple of mechanical fixes that buy us time to do the kind of deep introspection and challenging things that we need to do. I do believe, though, sir, that we have it in us to do it. That I see that in my children too. We talk about it being a long time, and how on issues of race, on issues of kind of building the egalitarian community that we have always imagined ourselves to really be. I'm 62 years old. we are going through a time of upheaval that I haven't seen since I was a child. But I've also seen tremendous progress in my lifetime. My generation is less toxic on those issues than my parents' generation was. And as much as I like to think of myself as enlightened, my children all think of me as an unreconstructed Cro-Magnon, and I think that's wonderful because it means that they've passed me.
Okay. Well, thank you.
I have a question. Do you work with any of the groups that are out there attempting to get laws changed, like Every Town and the group of people in Newtown?
I've recently joined the authors board with Every Town. Okay, there's a board of authors that, and I've only recently done that. I sort of generally see my role as basically a storyteller is to remain largely largely independent. I'm a voice. That's what I am.
Yeah, but you can provide information and support in your own
and
style.
And for example, working, joining the authors board, it's to do that. It's to turn around. It's because our objectives and our methods jive. To the degree that I can, I will support them, and to the degree that they can, they'll support me. And the idea is to turn around and try and advance certain objectives.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, I think more and more voices need to come out from people who are in the middle of the NRA, because it feels like it's just been a vast wasteland of
We've been silent.
Some people who want it, and most people on that side don't want it. And so I like I said, I can't believe people can watch what's going on with the mass murders and just say, well, it doesn't mean anything, because it means a lot every time it happens.
No, I agree.
Okay.
I think we have time for a few more questions. It's nearing our 9 o'clock hour, where we traditionally stop. So any other thoughts or last minute questions?
I just have one on the Second Amendment. I recognize it's in our DNA, but just philosophically, is it still relevant in today's world? Do we need in your opinion, do we still need a Second Amendment? And are we that unique in the world in that regard?
I think two things. I'm going to put this three ways. I live in a state where people still feed their families with venison. I do myself. I live in a state where the first Monday after Thanksgiving, the schools are closed in much of the state because people are expected to do that. I believe that there is some value to having those rights and the responsibilities that come with them enshrined and protected. But I also believe that you're probably right. That because of the intransigence of the gun manufacturers and their lobby and the puppets they have in various legislatures around the states, that the prevailing sense among the generation that's coming up after me is yours. Why do we need this Second Amendment? So at this stage of the game, regardless of how I might feel about it, doesn't matter. That question needs to go to my kids. I will say this. I would be very cautious in a culture that is as divided as ours with tinkering with rights enshrined in the first 10. I would be very cautious about opening that can of worms in this day and age.
Mhm.
I can't hear you, Pat.
I'm sorry, I was muted. One more question and then we probably should wrap it up.
Yeah, my chickens are yelling at me.
All right.
Well,
Hey.
thank you for spending time with us.
Oh, folks, it was delightful.
Yeah, thank you very much. And, you know, down the road, next book comes along, you know, maybe we
There are no more books. I'm done. I'm done.
done.
You did your one book.
This is the last one.
Very much.
That's the other thing. It's time for those of us who've had the stage for a very long time. I wrote this book because I had to, because a guy like me had to write this book. But it's time for us to step off the stage and let other younger, different voices take over.
Yep.
Well, again,
Well, thank you. It's been really great.
Thank you, folks.
Wonderful discussion. So I really appreciate you taking the time out. And A Taller Tower.
From a Taller Tower, The Rise of the
From a Taller
American Mass
Tower.
Shooter.
Great book.
Came out today as an audio book, if anybody's interested.
Oh, great. Who
Excellent.
is the voice actor? Is it you?
I can't remember his name. Between you,
Okay.
I'm not wild about him.
Wasn't you.
I wanted it to be me, but it wasn't.
All right, great.
All
Well,
right.
we will look for it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, folks.
Yep. And good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. See you see you in June, everyone.
Thank you.